12. The hand that lit my cigarette, I saw, was trembling. A desire to do something violent woke in me, suddenly, to move energetically, to push or drive something away. "What was it?" I asked abruptly, in a louder, half-challenging voice, intended for the man at the piano. Such a performance upon others, without first asking their permission, seems to me unpermissible. And it was Molson who replied. He ignored the end of my sentence as though he had not heard it. He strolled over to our side, taking a cigarette and pressing it carefully into shape between his long, thin fingers. "You may well ask," he answered quietly, "but it's not so easy to tell. We discovered it," he nodded towards Eiley, 2 years ago, in the valley. It lay beside a priest, a very important personage apparently, and was part of the ritual he used in the worship of the sun. It's in the museum now. You can see it any day at the Bulak. It's simply labelled Hymn to Ra. The period was Akhenaton's. "The words, yes," put in Eiley, who was listening closely. "The words," repeated Molson in a curious tone. "There are no words. It's all really a manipulation of the vowel sounds, and the rhythm or chanting, or whatever you like to call it. I invented myself. The Egyptians did not write down their music, you see." He suddenly searched my face a moment with questioning eyes. "Any words you heard," he said, "or thought you heard, were merely your own interpretation." I stared at him, making no rejoinder. "They made use of what they called a root language in their rituals," he went on, "and it consisted entirely of vowel sounds. There were no consonants, for vowel sounds, you see, run on forever, without end or beginning, whereas consonants interrupt their flow and break it up and limit it. A consonant has no sound of its own at all. Real language is continuous." We stood a moment, smoking in silence. I understood then that this thing Molson had done was based on definite knowledge. He had rendered some fragment of an ancient ritual he and Eiley had unearthed together, and while he knew its effect upon the latter, he chanced it on myself. Not otherwise, I feel, could it have influenced me in the extraordinary way it did. In the faith and poetry of a nation lies its soul life, and the gigantic faith of Egypt blazed behind the rhythm of that long, monotonous chant. There were blood and heart and nerves in it. Millions had heard it sung, millions had wept and prayed and yearned. It was ensouled by the passion of that marvellous civilization that loved the godhead of the sun, and that now hid, waiting but still alive, below the ground. The majestic faith of ancient Egypt poured up with it, that tremendous, burning elaboration of the afterlife and of eternity that was the pivot of those spacious days. For centuries, vast multitudes, led by their royal priests, had uttered this very form and ritual, believed it, lived it, felt it. The rising of the sun remained its climax. Its spiritual power still clung to the great ruined symbols. The faith of a buried civilization had burned back into the present and into our hearts as well. And a curious respect for the man who was able to produce this effect upon 2 modern minds crept over me and mingled with the repulsion that I felt. I looked furtively at his withered, dried-up features. He wore some vague and shadowy impress still of what had just been in him. There was a stony appearance in his shrunken cheeks. He looked smaller. I saw him lessened. I thought of him as he had been so short a time before, imprisoned in his great stone captors that had obsessed him. "There's tremendous power in it, an awful power," I stammered, more to break the oppressive pause than for any desire in me to speak with him. "It brings back Egypt in some extraordinary way. Ancient Egypt, I mean. Brings it close. into the heart. My words ran on of their own accord almost. I spoke with a hush unwittingly. There was awe in me. Eiley had moved away towards the window, leaving me face to face with this strange incarnation of another age. "It must," he replied, deep light still glowing in his eyes, "for the soul of the old days is in it. No one, I think, can hear it and remain the same. It expresses, you see, the essential passion and beauty of that gorgeous worship, that splendid faith, that reasonable and intelligent worship of the sun, the only scientific belief the world has ever known. Its popular form, of course, was largely superstitious, but the sacerdotal form, the form used by the priests, that is, who understood the relationship between colour, sound, and symbol, was—" He broke off suddenly, as though he had been speaking to himself. We sat down. George Eiley leaned out of the window with his back to us, watching the desert in the moonless night. "You have tried its effect before on others?" I asked point blank. "Upon myself," he answered shortly. "Upon others," I insisted. He hesitated an instant. "Upon one other, yes," he admitted. "Intentionally?" And something quivered in me as I asked it. He shrugged his shoulders slightly. "I'm merely a speculative archaeologist," he smiled, and an imaginative Egyptologist. My bounden duty is to reconstruct the past so that it lives for others." An impulse rose in me to take him by the throat. "You know perfectly well, of course, the magical effect it's sure, likely at least to have." He stared steadily at me through the cigarette smoke. To this day I cannot think exactly what it was in this man that made me shudder. "I'm sure of nothing," he replied smoothly, "but I consider it quite legitimate to try. Magical, the word you used, has no meaning for me. If such a thing exists, it is merely scientific, undiscovered or forgotten knowledge." An insolent, aggressive light shone in his eyes as he spoke. His manner was almost truculent. "You refer, I take it, to our friend rather than to yourself." And with difficulty I met his singular stare. From his whole person something still emanated that was forbidding, yet overmasteringly persuasive. It brought back the notion of that invisible web, that dim gauze curtain, that motionless influence lying, waiting, at the centre for its prey, those monstrous and mysterious items standing, alert and watchful, through the centuries. "You mean," he added lower, "his altered attitude to life, his going?" To hear him use the words, the very phrase, struck me with a sudden chill. Before I could answer, however, and certainly before I could master the touch of horror that rushed over me, I heard him continuing in a whisper. It seemed again that he spoke to himself as much as he spoke to me. "The soul, I suppose, has the right to choose its own conditions and surroundings. To pass elsewhere involves translation, not extinction." He smoked a moment in silence, then said another curious thing, looking up into my face with an expression of intense earnestness. Something genuine in him again replaced the pose of cynicism. "The soul is eternal and can take its place anywhere, regardless of mere duration. What is there in the vulgar and superficial present that should hold it so exclusively? And where can it find today the belief, the faith, the beauty that are the very essence of its life? Where in the rush and scatter of this tawdry age can it make its home? Shall it flutter forever in a valley of dry bones, when a living past lies ready and waiting, with loveliness, strength, and glory?" He moved closer. He touched my arm. I felt his breath upon my face. "Come with us," he whispered awfully. "Come back with us. Withdraw your life from the rubbish of this futile ugliness. Come back and worship with us in the spirit of the past. Take up the old, old splendour, the glory, the immense conceptions, the wondrous certainty, the ineffable knowledge of essentials. It all lies about you still. It's calling, ever calling. It's very close. It draws you day and night, calling, calling, calling. His voice died off curiously into distance on the word. I can hear it to this day, and the soft droning quality in the intense yet fading tone. Calling, calling, calling. But his eyes turned wicked. I felt the sinister power of the man. I was aware of madness in his thought and mind. The past he sought to glorify, I saw black, as with the forbidding Egyptian darkness of a plague. It was not beauty, but death, that I heard, calling, calling, calling. It's real, he went on, hardly aware that I shrank, and not a dream. These ruined symbols still remain in touch with that which was. They are potent today as they were 6,000 years ago. The amazing life of those days brims behind them. They are not mere masses of oppressive stone. They express in visible form great powers that still are knowable. He lowered his head, peered up into my face, and whispered. Something secret passed into his eyes. I saw you change, came the words below his breath, as you saw the change in us. But only worship can produce that change. The soul assumes the qualities of the deity it worships. The powers of its deity possess it, and transform it into its own likeness. You also felt it. You also were possessed. I saw the stone-faced deity upon your own. I seemed to shake myself as a dog shakes water from its body. I stood up. I remembered that I stretched my hands out as though to push him from me and expel some creeping influence from my mind. I remember another thing as well. But for the reality of the sequel, and but for the matter-of-fact result still facing me today in the disappearance of George Eiley, the loss to the present time of all George Eiley was, I might have found subject for laughter in what I saw. Comedy was in it certainly, yet it was both ghastly and terrific. Deep horror crept below the aspect of the ludicrous, for the apparent mimicry cloaked truth. It was appalling, because it was real. In the large mirror that reflected the room behind me, I saw myself and Molson. I saw Eiley too in the background, by the open window, and the attitude of all three was the attitude of hieroglyphics come to life. My arms indeed were stretched, but not stretched as I had thought in mere self-defence. They were stretched unnaturally. The forearms made those strange, obtuse angles that the old carved granite wears. The palms of the hands held upwards, the heads thrown back, the legs advanced, the bodies stiffened into postures that expressed forgotten, ancient minds. The physical conformation of all three was monstrous, and yet reverence and truth dictated even the uncouthness of the gestures. Something in all three of us inspired the forms our bodies had assumed. Our attitudes expressed buried yearnings, emotions, tendencies, whatever they may be termed, that the spirit of the past evoked. I saw the reflected picture but for a moment. I dropped my arms, aware of foolishness in my way of standing. Molson moved forward with his long, significant stride, and at the same instant Eiley came up quickly and joined us from his place by the open window. We looked into each other's faces without a word. There was this little pause that lasted perhaps 10 seconds. But in that pause, I felt the entire world slide past me. I heard the centuries rush by at headlong speed. The present dipped away. Existence was no longer in a line that stretched two ways. It was a circle in which ourselves, together with past and future, stood motionless at the centre, all details equally accessible at once. The three of us were falling backwards. "Come," said the voice of Molson solemnly, but with the sweetness as of a child anticipating joy. "Come, let us go together, for the boat of Ra has crossed the underworld. The darkness has been conquered. Let us go out together and find the dawn. Listen, it is calling, calling, calling." 13. I was aware of rushing, but it was the soul in me that rushed. It experienced dizzy, unutterable alterations. Thousands of emotions, intense and varied, poured through me at lightning speed, each satisfyingly known, yet gone before its name appeared. The life of many centuries tore headlong back with me, and, as in drowning, this epitome of existence shot in a few seconds the steep slopes the past had so laboriously built up. The changes flashed and passed. I wept and prayed and worshipped. I loved and suffered. I battled, lost and won. Down the gigantic scale of ages, that telescoped thus into a few brief moments, the soul in me went sliding backwards towards a motionless, reposeful past. I remember foolish details that interrupted the immense descent. I put on coat and hat. I remember someone's words, strangely sounding as when some bird wakes us up and sings at midnight. "We'll take the little door, the front one's locked by now." And I have a vague recollection of the outline of the great hotel, with its colonnades and terraces fading behind me through the air. But these details merely flickered and disappeared, as though I fell earthwards from a star and passed feathers or blown leaves upon the way. There was no friction as my soul dropped backwards into time. The flight was easy and silent as a dream. I felt myself sucked down into gulfs whose emptiness offered no resistance, until at last the appalling speed decreased of its own accord, and the dizzy flight became a kind of gentle floating. It changed imperceptibly into a gliding motion, as though the angle altered. My feet, quite naturally, were on the ground, moving through something soft that clung to them and rustled while it clung. I looked up and saw the bright armies of the stars. In front of me, I recognized the flat-topped, shadowy ridges. On both sides lay the open expanses of familiar wilderness, and beside me, one on either hand, moved two figures who were my companions. We were in the desert, but it was the desert of thousands of years ago. My companions, moreover, though familiar to some part of me, seemed strangers or half-known. Their names I strove in vain to capture. Molesley, Ilson sounded in my head, mingled together falsely, and when I stole a glance at them, I saw dark lines of mannequins unfilled with substance, and was aware of the grotesque gestures of living hieroglyphics. It seemed for an instant that their arms were bound behind their backs impossibly, and that their heads turned sharply across their lineal shoulders. But for a moment only, for at a second glance I saw them solid and compact. Their names came back to me. Our arms were linked together as we walked. We had already covered a great distance, for my limbs were aching and my breath was short. The air was cold, the silence absolute. It seemed in this faint light that the desert flowed beneath our feet rather than that we advanced by taking steps. Cliffs with hooded tops moved past us. Boulders glided. Mounds of sand slid by. And then I heard a voice upon my left that was surely Molson speaking. "Towards Enet our feet are set," he half sang, half murmured. "Towards Enet Tentore, There, in the house of birth, we shall dedicate our hearts and lives anew. And the language, no less than the musical intonation of his voice, enraptured me. For I understood he spoke of Dendera, in whose majestic temple recent hands had painted with deathless colours the symbols of our cosmic relationships with the zodiacal signs. And Dendera was our great seat of worship of the goddess Hathor, the Egyptian Aphrodite, bringer of love and joy. The falcon-headed Horus was her husband, from whom in his home at Edfu we imbibed swift kinds of power, and it was the time of the new year, the great feast when the forces of the living earth turn upwards into happy growth. We were on foot across the desert towards Dendera, and this sand we trod was the sand of thousands of years ago. The paralysis of time and distance involved some amazing lightness of the spirit that, I suppose, touched ecstasy. There was intoxication in the soul. I was not divided from the stars, nor separate from this desert that rushed with us. The unhampered wind blew freshly from my nerves and skin, and the Nile, glimmering faintly on our right, lay with its lapping waves in both my hands. I knew the life of Egypt, for it was in me, over me, round me. I was a part of it. We went happily like birds to meet the sunrise. There were no pits of measured time and interval that could detain us. We flowed, yet were at rest. We were endlessly alive. Present and future alike were inconceivable. We were in the kingdom of the past. The pyramids were just a building, and the army of obelisks looked around them, proud of their first balance. Thebes swung her 100 gates upon the world. New shining Memphis glittered with myriad reflections into waters that the tears of Isis sweetened, and the cliffs of Abu Simbel were still innocent of their gigantic progeny. Alone, the Sphinx, linking timelessness with time, brooded, unguessed and underived upon an alien world. We marched with antiquity towards Dendera. How long we marched, how fast, how far we went, I can remember as little as the marvellous speech that passed across me while my two companions spoke together. I only remember that suddenly a wave of pain disturbed my wondrous happiness and caused my calm, which had seemed beyond all reach of break, to fall away. I heard their voices abruptly with a kind of terror. A sensation of fear, of loss, of nightmare, bewilderment came over me like cold wind. What they lived naturally, true to their inmost hearts, I lived merely by means of a temperamental sympathy, and the stage had come at which my powers failed. Exhaustion overtook me. I wilted. The strain, the abnormal backward stretch of consciousness that was put upon me by another, gave way and broke. I heard their voices, faint and horrible. My joy was extinguished. A glare of horror fell upon the desert, and the stars seemed evil. An anguishing desire for the safe and wholesome present usurped all this mad yearning to obtain the past. My feet fell out of step. The rushing of the desert paused. I unlinked my arms. We stopped, all three. The actual spot is, to this day, well known to me. I found it afterwards. I even photographed it. It lies actually not far from Helwan, a few miles at most beyond the solitary palm, where slopes of undulating sand mark the opening of a strange, enticing valley called the Wadi Gerawi. And it is enticing because it beckons and leads on. Here, amid torn gorges of a limestone wilderness, there is suddenly soft yellow sand that flows and draws the feet onward. It slips away with one too easily. Always the next ridge and basin must be seen, each time a little farther. It has the quality of decoying. The cliffs say no, but this streaming sand invites. In its flowing curves of gold there is enchantment. And it was here, upon its very lips, we stopped, the rhythm of our steps broken, our hearts no longer one. My temporary rapture vanished. I was aware of fear, for the present rushed upon me with attack in it, and I felt that my mind was arrested close upon the edge of madness. Something cleared and lifted in my brain. The soul indeed could choose its dwelling place, but to live elsewhere completely was the choice of madness, and to live divorced from all the sweet, wholesome business of today involved an exile that was worse than madness. It was death. My heart burned for George Isley. I remembered the tear upon his cheek, the agony of his struggle I shared suddenly with him. Yet with him was the reality, with me a sympathetic reflection merely. He was already too far gone to fight. I shall never forget the desolation of that strange scene beneath the morning stars. The desert lay down and watched us. We stood upon the brink of a little broken ridge, looking into the valley of golden sand. This sand gleamed soft and wonderful in the starlight some 20 feet below. The descent was easy, but I would not move. I refused to advance another step. I saw my companions in the mysterious half-light beside me, peering over the edge, Mosen in front a little. And I turned to him, sure of the part I meant to play, yet conscious painfully of my helplessness. My personality seemed a straw in midstream that spun in a futile effort to arrest the flood that bore it. There was vivid human conflict in the moment's silence. It was an eddy that paused in the great body of the tide, and then I spoke. Oh, I was ashamed of the insignificance of my voice and the weakness of my little personality. Mosen, we go no farther with you. We have already come too far. We now turn back. Behind my words were a paltry 30 years. His answer drove 60 centuries against me, for his voice was like the wind that passed whispering down the stream of yellow sand below us. He smiled. Our feet are set towards Enet Ten Tore. There is no turning back. Listen, it is calling, calling, calling. We will go home, I cried in a tone I vainly strove to make imperative. Our home is there, he sang, pointing with one long, thin arm towards the brightening east. For the temple calls us, and the river takes our feet. We shall be in the house of birth to meet the sunrise. You lie, I cried again. You speak the lies of madness, and this past you see is the house of death. It is the kingdom of the underworld. The words tore wildly, impotently out of me. I seized George Isley's arm. Come back with me, I pleaded vehemently, my heart aching with a nameless pain for him. We'll retrace our steps. Come home with me. Come back. Listen, the present calls you sweetly. His arm slipped horribly out of my grasp that had seemed to hold it so tightly. Mosen, already below us in the yellow sand, looked small with distance. He was gliding rapidly farther with uncanny swiftness. The The diminution of his form was ghastly. It was like a doll's, and his voice rose up faint as with the distance of great gulfs of space. Calling, calling, you hear it forever calling. It died away with the wind along that sandy valley, and the past swept in a flood across the brightening sky. I swayed as though a storm was at my back. I reeled. Almost I went too, over the crumbling edge into the sand. "Come back with me! Come home!" I cried, more faintly. "The present alone is real. There is work, ambition, duty. There is beauty too, the beauty of good living. And there is love. There is a woman calling, calling." That other voice took up the world below me. I heard the faint refrain sing down the sandy walls, the wild, sweet pang in it that was marvellous. "Our feet are set for Enet ten Tore. It is calling, calling." My voice fell into nothingness. George Eiley was below me now, his outline tiny against the sheet of yellow sand, and the sand was moving. The desert rushed again. The human figures receded swiftly into the past they had reconstructed with the creative yearning of their souls. I stood alone upon the edge of crumbling limestone, helplessly watching them. It was amazing what I witnessed, while the shafts of crimson dawn rose up the sky. The enormous desert turned alive to the horizon with gold and blue and silver. The purple shadows melted into grey. The flat-topped ridges shone. Huge messengers of light flashed everywhere at once. The radiance of sunrise dazzled my outer sight. But if my eyes were blinded, my inner sight was focused the more clearly upon what followed. I witnessed the disappearance of George Eiley. There was a dreadful magic in the picture. The pair of them, small and distant below me in that little sandy hollow, stood out sharply defined as in a miniature. I saw their outlines, neat and terrible, like some ghastly inset against the enormous scenery. Though so close to me, in actual space, they were centuries away in time. And a dim, vast shadow was about them that was not mere shadow of the ridges. It encompassed them. It moved, crawling over the sand, obliterating them. Within it, like insects lost in amber, they became visibly imprisoned, dwindled in size, borne deep away, absorbed. And then I recognized the outline. Once more, but this time recumbent and spread flat upon the desert's face. I knew the monstrous shapes of the twin obsessing symbols. The spirit of ancient Egypt lay over all the land, tremendous in the dawn. The sunrise summoned her. She lay prostrate before the deity. The shadows of the towering colossi lay prostrate too. The little humans, with their worshipping and conquered hearts, lay deep within them. George Eiley I saw clearest. The distinctness, the reality were appalling. He was naked, robbed, undressed. I saw him a skeleton, picked clean to the very bones as by an acid. His life lay hid in the being of that mighty past. Egypt had absorbed him. He was gone. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't keep them closed. They opened of their own accord. The three of us were nearing the great hotel that rose yellow with shuttered windows in the early sunshine. A wind blew briskly from the north across the Mokattam hills. There were soft cannonball clouds dotted about the sky and across the Nile, where the mist lay in a line of white. I saw the tops of the pyramids gleaming like mountain peaks of gold. A string of camels laden with white stone went past us. I heard the crying of the natives in the streets of Helluan, and as we went up the steps, the donkeys arrived and camped in the sandy road beside their bersim till the tourists claimed them. "Good morning," cried Abdullah, the man who owned them. "You all go to Saqqara today, or Memphis. Beautiful day today, and very good donkeys." Molson went up to his room without a word, and Eiley did the same. I thought he staggered a moment as he turned the passage corner from my sight. His face wore a look of vacancy that some call peace. There was radiance in it. It made me shudder. Aching in mind and body, and no word spoken, I followed their example. I went upstairs to bed, and slept a dreamless sleep till after sunset. 14. And I woke with a lost, unhappy feeling that a withdrawing tide had left me on the shore, alone and desolate. My first instinct was for my friend George Eiley, and I noticed a square white envelope with my name upon it in his writing. Before I opened it, I knew quite well what the words would be inside. "We're going up to Thebes," the note informed me simply. "We leave by the night train, if you care to." But the last 4 words were scratched out again, though not so thickly that I couldn't read them. Then came the address of the Egyptologist's house, and the signature, very firmly traced. "Yours ever, George Eiley." I glanced at my watch and saw that it was after 7 o'clock. The night train left at 6:30. They had already started. The pain of feeling forsaken, left behind, was deep and bitter for myself, but what I felt for him, old friend and comrade, was even more intense, since it was hopeless. Fear and conventional emotion had stopped me at the very gates of an amazing possibility, some state of consciousness that, realizing the past, might doff the present, and by slipping out of time, experience eternity. That was the seduction I had escaped by the uninspired resistance of my pettier soul. Yet he, my friend, yielding in order to conquer, had obtained an awful prize. I understood the picture's other side as well, with an unutterable poignancy of pity, the prize of immobility, which is sheer stagnation, the imagined bliss, which is a false escape, the dream of finding beauty away from present things. From that dream, the awakening must be rude indeed. Clutching at vanished stars, he had clutched the oldest illusion in the world. To me it seemed the negation of life that had betrayed him. The pity of it burned in me like a flame. But I did not care to follow him and his companion. I waited at Helwan for his return, filling the empty days with yet emptier explanations. I felt as a man who sees what he loves sinking down into clear deep water, still within visible reach, yet gone beyond recovery. Molson had taken him back to Thebes, and Egypt, monstrous effigy of the past, had caught her prey. The rest, moreover, is easily told. Molson I never saw again. To this day I have never seen him, though his subsequent books are known to me, and the banal fact that he is numbered with those energetic and deluded enthusiasts who start a new religion, obtain notoriety, a few hysterical followers, and oblivion. George Eiley, however, returned to Helwan after a fortnight's absence. I saw him, knew him, talked and had my meals with him. We even did slight expeditions together. He was gentle and delightful as a woman who has loved a wonderful ideal and attained to it in memory. All roughness was gone out of him. He was smooth and polished as a crystal surface that reflects whatever is near enough to ask a picture. Yet his appearance shocked me inexpressibly. There was nothing in him. Nothing. It was the representation of George Eiley that came back from Thebes, the outer simulacra, the shell that walks the London streets today. I met no vestige of the man I used to know. George Eiley had disappeared. With this marvellous automaton I lived another month. The horror of him kept me company in a hotel where he moved among the cosmopolitan humanity as a ghost that visits the sunlight yet has its home elsewhere. This empty image of George Eiley lived with me in our Helwan hotel until the winds of early March informed his physical frame that discomfort was in the air and that he might as well move elsewhere happening to be northwards. And he left just as he stayed, automatically. His brain obeyed the conventional stimuli to which his nerves and consequently his muscles were accustomed. It sounds so foolish, but he took his ticket automatically. He gave the natural and adequate reasons automatically. He chose his ship and landing place in the same way that ordinary people choose those things. He said goodbye, like any other man who leaves casual acquaintances and hopes to meet them again. He lived, that is to say, entirely in his brain. His heart, his emotions, his temperament and personality, that nameless sum total for which the great sympathetic nervous system is accountable, all this, his soul, had gone elsewhere. This once vigorous, gifted being had become a normal, comfortable man that everybody could understand, a commonplace nonentity. He was precisely what the majority expected him to be, ordinary, a good fellow, a man of the world. He was delightful. He merely reflected daily life without partaking of it. To the majority it was hardly noticeable. Very pleasant was the general verdict. His ambition, his restlessness, his zeal had gone. That tireless zest whose driving power is yearning had taken flight, leaving behind it physical energy without spiritual desire. His soul had found its nest and flown to it. He lived in the chimera of the past, serene, indifferent, detached. I saw him immense, a shadowy, majestic figure standing, not moving, in a repose that was satisfying because it could not change. The size, the mystery, the immobility that caged him in seemed to me terrible, for I dared not intrude upon his awful privacy, and intimacy between us there was none. Of his experiences at Thebes I asked no single question. It was somehow not possible or legitimate. He, equally, vouchsafed no word of explanation. It was incommunicable to a dweller in the present. Between us was this barrier we both respected. He peered at modern life, incurious, listless, apathetic, through a dim gauze curtain. He was behind it. People round us were going to Saqqara and the pyramids, to see the Sphinx by moonlight, to dream at Edfu and at Dendera. Others described their journeys to Aswan, Khartoum and Abu Simbel, and gave details of their encampments in the desert. Wind, wind, wind. The winds of Egypt blew and sang and sighed. From the White Nile came the travellers, and from the Blue Nile, from the Fayoum, and from nameless excavations without end. They talked and wrote their books. They had the magpie knowledge of the present. The Egyptologists, big and little, read the writing on the wall and put the hieroglyphs and papyri into modern language. Alone, George Eiley knew the secret. He lived it. And the high passionate calm, the lofty beauty, the glamour and enchantment that are the spell of this thrice haunted land were in my soul as well, sufficiently for me to interpret his condition. I could not leave. Yet having left, I could not stay away. I yearned for the Egypt that he knew. No word I uttered, speech could not approach it. We wandered by the Nile together, and through the groves of palms that once were Memphis. The sandy wastes beyond the pyramids knew our footsteps. The Mokattam ridges, purple at evening and golden in the dawn, held our passing shadows as we silently went by. At no single dawn or sunset was he to be found indoors, and it became my habit to accompany him, The joy of worship in his soul was marvellous. The great still skies of Egypt watched us, the hanging stars, the gigantic dome of blue. We felt together that burning southern wind, the golden sweetness of the sun lay in our blood as we saw the great boats take the northern breeze upstream. Immensity was everywhere, and this golden magic of the sun. But it was in the desert especially, where only sun and wind observe the faint signalling of time, where space is nothing because it is not divided, and where no detail reminds the heart that the world is called today. It was in the desert this curtain hung most visibly between us, he on that side, I on this. It was transparent. He was with a multitude no man can number, towering to the moon, yet spreading backwards towards his burning source of life, drawn out by the sun and by the crystal air into some vast interior magnitude. The spirit of George Eiley hung beside me, close yet far away in the haze of the olden days. And sometimes he moved. I was aware of gestures. His head was raised to listen. One arm swung shadowy across the sea of broken ridges. From leagues away a line of sand rose slowly. There was a rustling. Another, an enormous arm emerged to meet his own, and two stupendous figures drew together, poised above time, yet throned upon the centuries they knew eternity. So easily they remained possessors of the land. Facing the east, they waited for the dawn, and their marvellously forgotten singing poured across the world.